Stay strong, stay strong. 8 minutes, 46 seconds, my days long, days long. Marching from Texas, singing them same songs, same songs. My mama, my brother praying I make it on. I came home. Stay strong, stay strong. 8 minutes, 46 seconds, my days long, days long. Marching from Texas, singing them same songs, same songs. My mama, my brother praying I make it on. I came home. It ain't because I'm reaching that I'm out here preaching. I'm preaching for a reason, saving life this season. Camera phones recording, showing them acting out.
Good evening and welcome to Beyond the Game. I'm Zachary Draves. With many people consumed by everyday realities and the constant barrage of political and current events, it shouldn't come as a surprise that most people probably don't know that the Winter Olympics in Beijing are right around the corner. The Games are set to begin on February 3rd, and already it is destined to be a very surreal Games for a myriad of reasons, particularly COVID and the ongoing human rights abuses in China. For the thousands of athletes, journalists, and other personnel heading to Beijing, they will be entering into a very dystopic space due to China's strict COVID protocols, where they will be completely isolated from the general public and forbidden from traveling outside the parameters of the Olympic venues and village. No fans, families, and other outside spectators will be present. Then there is the other elephant in the room, which is China's monstrous human rights abuses, from the subjugation and torture of the Uyghur Muslims and other minority populations, to the repression of freedom in Hong Kong, to the vulnerable state of the country of Taiwan, just to name a few. It is evident that the host nation of China should have not been rewarded with hosting an Olympics in the first place. But that says plenty about the IOC and what they prioritize. Just look at history. So with all this happening, how should those participating in the Games respond? And what does this mean for the future of the Olympics? To help us out, we have two amazing voices entering this space. Former Olympic cross-country skier Noah Hoffman and Rob Kholer, Director General of the human rights organization Global Athlete. So we are really thrilled to have both Noah and Rob join us on Beyond the Game to have this important conversation. Noah and Rob, welcome to Beyond the Game.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Zach.
It's a pleasure. So obviously a lot to get into in such a short time. But I kind of want to start off sort of looking back at where we were, several years ago to where we are now. And Noah, let me start off with you, since you have competed in the Olympics. You competed in 2014 in Sochi, and you competed in Pyeongchang in 2018. If my recollection of those games was that there was a lot of hype surrounding the games. Obviously there were a lot of pressing global issues that were happening during that time. I mean, obviously in Sochi with Putin's Russia, and then with the invasion of Ukraine, and then you also in Pyeongchang with the whole issue of Korea, North and South Korea. But I sensed that there was a buildup, that there was an anticipation to those games, irrespective of that. And it doesn't really seem like that's the case now, which we'll get into, but I just kind of want to hear it from you. Was into the games that you competed into?
So I know that, as you said, there were plenty of global issues happening around those games, in particular around Sochi, right? The astronomical cost of the games, the unfinished infrastructure, the environmental damage. There was a lot of talk on U.S. media about like the stray dogs that were prevalent in the Sochi area. But as an athlete, I was completely insulated from all of that. I was so excited to be going to my first Olympics, and it felt like the whole world's eyes were on me, and it felt like I had an opportunity to do this thing and compete at this level that I had dreamed of literally my entire life. And then Pyeongchang was a repeat, and there were even fewer issues around Pyeongchang, and it just felt like it was all focused on sport. And I can't tell you, I'm not going to these Olympics. That's why I'm able to speak out about them. But I've been in touch with a couple of current athletes that are on their way to the games, and one of them told me that they have not had a single team meeting this season focused on their performance at the Olympics. They've been entirely talking about either the COVID protocols or personal safety, and dealing with logistics like getting burner phones and rental computers because they're not going to have any digital privacy while they're there. And this, I cannot tell you how different that is and how distracting it must be for my teammates and for these athletes who are heading over to Beijing to compete. Of course, the whole entire world is different because of the pandemic, but the human rights abuses are equally distracting to these athletes, and that's something that was just not in place when I was going to either of the Olympics that I went to.
So you obviously have been making the rounds on various media outlets, on cable news, and you have been really speaking about what your teammates and what other athletes have said. And you have been really adamant about telling them not to speak out while they're there. Explain more of what you mean by that.
Yeah, we saw just last week one of the members of the Beijing organizing committee come out and say any athlete that speaks contrary to the laws of China will be punished. And it's, first of all, very ambiguous what that punishment can be. And in China, it can be everything from a disappearance, like we've seen with Pong Shui, to being extradited to incarceration. So first of all, there's that fear. But then more importantly is the laws of China when it comes to speech are extremely opaque. And so what is it that athletes can and can't say? And the IOC, of course, says, oh, well, we defer to local laws. So they're not promising to protect athletes who speak out in what is deemed to be contrary to the laws of China. In addition to that, if the athlete says anything on the field of play or the podium, the IOC is threatening to be one of the entities that actually punishes athletes. So you have both of the entities that should be protecting athletes, the organizing committee of the games and the host country, and then on the other hand, the IOC, both threatening to punish athletes who speak about political issues, who exercise a fundamental human right of freedom of expression. It's a horrible situation for athletes. And so if neither of the people who should be protecting athletes are going to be protecting, and both are actually threatening athletes to punish with punishment, then the only logical thing is an athlete who has no choice but to attend the games. I'm happy to speak more about that. That athletes should stay silent. They should not be putting their lives at risk, and that's why I'm speaking out, because I don't think my teammates who are heading to these games should be, and because I think that it needs to be very clear that the IOC has put athletes in this position. This is the IOC's fault. The IOC needs to be accountable to athletes. It needs to be accountable to human rights globally. It needs to be accountable to not let the games be used by authoritarian regimes in furtherance of their power that's used to violate human rights. This all comes back to the IOC and to a lack of accountability. That's why I'm speaking out.
And then just to let everybody know that Pong Shui was the Chinese tennis player who back in early November disappeared after she publicly came forward and accused a Chinese government official of sexual assault, who, by the way, happened to be one of the chief organizers of the Beijing Olympics. And she has been making, appearing in brief conversations with Thomas Bach, who's the head of the IOC, to give off this impression that she's somehow safe and somehow okay and that she's fine and that there's nothing to see here. But many people are not buying into that for obvious reasons. And, there was a whole campaign, hashtag where is Pong Shui. The Women's Tennis Association pulled tournaments out of Beijing to make a statement, which was an extremely courageous move on their part, to say the least. Rob, let me turn it over to you. Given the backdrop of all this and given the work that your organization does promoting human rights through sport, what role is your organization taking to support athletes and also to hold entities like the IOC accountable?
Well, I think we're doing it right now, Zach. For the fact that we are bringing the issue to the forefront, because the IOC certainly isn't. The IOC has stuck their head in the sand and are hoping to get out of this games and move on to Paris, when you simply can't ignore what's happening. You simply can't ignore that athletes are being treated the way they are and putting these positions. So, our role is to advocate and speak on behalf of athletes, to address these issues, to ensure athletes are safe. And we're going to go further. We just had a call similar to what we did leading into Tokyo. And as Noah said, we are encouraging athletes not to speak up. But as an athlete-led organization by athletes for athletes, we have to be able to stand back and say, okay, let's say an athlete does speak up. we have to support them. If an athlete does use their freedom of expression and exercise their right, we have engaged with human rights lawyers, human rights organizations, and sport lawyers to have on standby should any athlete decide to express their right to freedom of expression. So while we're advising not to, we also have a duty of care to make sure if they do, that there is some type of protection that we can offer or support moving forward. And we're hoping that we'll announce that next week, but it's in the works. So it's a dual role, advising, but not putting our heads in the sand in case someone does decide to take that podium or to stand up and talk about the human rights abuse or any social racial justice issues in Beijing.
Absolutely. And then one of the things that should be pointed out is the IOC has what is known as Rule 50 on the books. Rob, why don't you explain to us what Rule 50 is?
Well, Rule 50 has been Rule 50.2 has been in place for a while. And I think that's where you hear the tone and the frustration in Noah and other athletes is at one point, athletes were not allowed to say anything in terms of raising any social, racial justice issues, any political issues. It was totally off the table. And for the past 2.5 years, global athlete and athlete organizations and human rights organizations have been continuously pushing the IOC to reform or even rescind that rule. And over time, there's so much pressure, the IOC ended up having to relax the rule. Not as far as it should be. So now the rule allows athletes to express their opinions in the media, to express them prior to the games, to express their opinions on Twitter or on social media, but they still remove the right for an athlete to speak up on the podium or field of play. And we still think that is an outrageous rule because since when do sport rules have the right to supersede basic UN Declaration of Human Rights, which is the right to freedom of expression? So we've come a long way. We haven't gone far enough. And that rule, as Noah said, punishes athletes who decide to stand up. The interesting thing is that punishment, which I think is by design, doesn't indicate what that is. It says if an athlete chooses to use the podium, there will be consequences. Doesn't say what the consequences are, doesn't say what anything's going to be. It just puts that threat out there. So you're left with this unknown consequence, which the IOC could place on you. And it also makes you believe if you are a superstar versus a lower level athlete, are you going to be treated differently? So the IOC has dealt with this very poorly, and that's why we continue to advocate for it be totally rescinded. And that's what we're looking for. And the interesting part is I mentioned that we are putting together a group of lawyers to defend and support athletes should they decide to do that. The similar thing was done leading into Tokyo. Athletes did take the podium, athletes did speak up, and the IOC did nothing. So let's see what happens in China, but we're still yielding the warning to stay quiet, but should they decide to, we have to be an organization to protect.
Mm-hmm. And it's worth noting that Rule 50 has been in place for decades, and it really was brought to the attention back this last year during the Tokyo Olympics, the Summer Olympics that were rescheduled in 2021 due to COVID, and the whole discussion around Rule 50 was brought up, and there were athletes who went to the games who did make political and social stands. Gwen Berry and Raven Saunders from the United States, at least, who, to name a few, and they weren't, or Gwen Berry didn't make a statement, but Raven Saunders did, and she wasn't punished. So to your point, Rob, the IOC lays out these rules and says that there will be consequences, but then they don't explain the consequences. Noah, let me turn back to you. You mentioned the IOC and the culpability that they play in this. Explain and elaborate more on that and why that's so important to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, the IOC is a supranational organization, meaning they transcend any national boundaries. In addition, they are an incredibly diverse organization. They encompass, 208 national Olympic committees and 40 plus international federations. And then they have, a multitude of sponsors. So they're not accountable to any one entity, and that's why we see these abuses over and over again. Is an organization that essentially functions as a dictatorship or as an authoritarian regime, and makes decisions in its own interest, in the interest of its own power, in the interest of its own monetary best interest, and not in the interest of its stakeholders. Its stakeholders include, first and foremost, athletes, but also host cities, also administrators, employees, citizens of the countries that are part of the Olympic movement. So, the list goes on and on. But the only entity we believe that can really hold the IOC accountable is athletes, because no single sponsor, a single sponsor can walk away, or the IOC can live without a single sponsor. And a single host city is only involved in the Olympic movement for 8 years, from the time they're awarded the games until the time the games happen, a little bit longer now that they've changed the process. But athletes are always at the center of the Olympic movement, and athletes always have the power to shape the Olympic movement if they exercise that power. But the IOC honestly has been masterful at using athletes to legitimize their powerful reign, their authoritarian decisions. They do this through the Ioc Athletes Commission, which is part of the IOC administration. It works within the administration. It is supported financially by the administration. It's like having United Auto Workers be part of the Ford Motor Company and expect them to actually do anything to hold the Ford Motor Company accountable. It's just laughable. Instead, the IOC Athletes Commission is used to do things like lead this reform of Rule 50 that really kept in place the core principles of Rule 50, and just made a little tiny bit of, or moved the goalpost just a tiny bit, to kind of be able to say, look, we're reforming, we're progressive, we're making these changes. And so you have to have an independent organization, coming back to the United Auto Workers, somebody who can actually have real leverage over the administration. And that just doesn't exist for the Olympic movement. And consequently, you have this organization that is continually caught up in corruption scandals, that is continually awarding the games to authoritarian dictatorships, that is making absurd demands of host cities in order to have to be treated like royalty in order to have a chance at receiving the games. Not very transparent, controls the list goes on and on, controls the regulators of sport by controlling the World Anti-Doping Agency and the Court of Arbitration for Sport, on and on and on, the problems with the IOC. And it all comes down to a lack of accountability. And it hurts the Olympic movement. It hurts athletes first and foremost. It hurts host cities. It hurts countries. It hurts everyone who's got a stake in this movement and in sport.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that window dressing that you brought up that the IOC routinely engages in, they prop up athletes to give off this impression that they're somehow living up to their own ideals. I mean, I can recall during the Tokyo Games, I believe it was, that on their Twitter page, on their official Twitter page, they put up a tweet acknowledging Tommy Smith and John Carlos from the '68 Olympics when they did this, right? And you saw the backlash come right away. It's like, wait a minute, you kicked them out of the Olympics in the moment they protested racial injustice. And now all these years later, you want to celebrate them and not even acknowledging the hardship that they had to go through all those years. And not just Smith and Carlos, but also Peter Norman from Australia. And then I'm glad you mentioned the whole issue of, the ramifications of a host city who puts on an Olympics and the after effects of it. I mean, I encourage everybody to look into Dr. Jules Boykoff, who's Associate Professor of Political Science at Pacific University, who we've had on the show, who does this work, calling out the Olympics and, looking at the effects of host cities in terms of economics and other forms of exploitation and so forth. So Noah, let me ask you about the athletes that you've spoken to, and obviously keeping, their privacy and their safety in mind. But what have they told you, like teammates of yours from the past? What have they told you? Have they told you that they want to speak out and seek you for advice?
I have a lot of relationships with athletes who are very well informed, very active on political issues, care deeply about human rights and the way that sport is used politically, often for illegitimate gains and against the will of athletes. And these athletes are resigned. They're frustrated. One athlete said that they feel like they're bounding together as a group of athletes in solidarity, that this is something they have to get through. They have to just shut up and go and focus on their sport and stay silent for their own safety. This is like completely against the nature of some of these athletes that I know that are really outspoken. They feel like this is something they have to endure. And that's not how the Olympic Games should be. That's not how either of my Olympic experiences was.
Mm-hmm. And Rob, now let me ask you, we had mentioned, Noah brought up the case of Pong Shui recently. And one of the things that was recently going on during the Australian Open was that there were spectators that were there that were wearing T-shirts that said, "Where is Pong Shui?" And first they were told that they had to take off their shirts or remove their shirts, and then they were told to leave. Explain more about the situation with Pong Shui and why that's relevant to the games.
Well, I think it's extremely relevant, and Tennis Australia kind of followed the lead of the IOC. And when Pong Shui came forward with the sexual assault allegations towards a top Chinese Communist Party official, and as you said earlier, a member of the bid committee for the 2022 Beijing Olympic Games, the first thing the IOC did was decide to have a call with her. And during that call, they never once mentioned what the issue was. So they never once mentioned the sexual assault allegations. They seemed to think everything would be fine over a cup of tea and dinner in Beijing, and we'll move on from the issue. And everything's fine. She's safe. And they went even further enough to say, we are athletes. Everyone on the call was athletes. We know athletes. And we could tell she was okay. Well, I'm sorry, but it takes a little more than an athlete to determine whether someone has been subject to or been sexually assaulted, or in terms of understanding that. And furthermore, understanding whether they're under duress when they are talking to the IOC. So the IOC played into China's hands. Everything has been wiped from the Chinese media in terms of allegations. And because the IOC didn't demand an independent investigation, they didn't demand her safe exit out of China, the issue's gone away. And Pong Shui has removed her allegations. And the IOC was complicit in the whole thing. The only organization to stand up was the WTA. And now we fast forward to the Australian Open, and the Australian Open, Tennis Australia, sent the exact same message to every person that's been sexually assaulted and has been a victim of sexual assault, is we don't want to hear about it, we don't care about it, so let's hide it. So anyone that wants to talk about Pong Shui, let's put it aside. And once again, it took forced change. So everything we're seeing is forcing change. Athlete groups spoke up. The human rights organizations spoke up. And what happened was the Tennis Australia had to reverse their decision. And this is a bigger issue where we're talking, and I could go on about the forced change that has happened over the past year in terms of forcing the IOC to change. We saw the forced change with Tennis Australia. This has been an ongoing thing, and it's not going to end. And every athlete deserves the right to have protection, to have their allegations explored, investigated, and not be put under the table. And the IOC clearly has shown, and this is part of the concern of going to China, is they have clearly shown they'll favor stakeholders over athlete rights. And they've done that with the Pong Shui case. They favor the Chinese government over the allegations of Pong Shui.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just the Australian Open, but also the NBA obviously has been in the news in recent years with regard to their relationship with China, because obviously China is a huge sports market and the NBA is very popular in China, or in some cases it's popular with China, I should say, because obviously if you speak out against China, then they blacklist you, as was the case with Daryl Morey, who was the general manager of the Houston Rockets, who a couple years ago put out a tweet supporting the freedom movement in Hong Kong. And as a result, China completely blacklisted Houston Rockets games, and the Houston Rockets, from what I understand, are a very popular team in China because obviously Yao Ming played there. Now you got players like Enes Kanter Freedom, who recently became an American citizen, NBA journeyman for the Boston Celtics, who has been very outspoken in his critique of the Chinese government. And whether you agree with him entirely or not, I mean, some things he does is right on the money and other things are questionable. But Rob, just in the work that you do, what do you make of the NBA's positioning when it comes to China?
Yeah, I mean, Zach, that's for another discussion altogether. And that's where I think today our responsibility is the immediate future. And that is focusing on Beijing, focusing on athletes going there. And that to us is our wheelhouse. We're not involved with the NBA, the NHL, the NFL. We're really involved in focusing on the Olympics, the Olympic athletes, Paralympic athletes, and making sure that their journey, when they go to the games, they have full protection. And we talk to shift a little bit about forced change. When we see forced change, that's happened over the past year. I mean, forced change, the IOC had been forced to relax Rule 40 because of athletes. The IOC has been forced to delay and postpone the games 4 weeks earlier because of athletes. The IOC is forced to allow breastfeeding women to bring their babies to Tokyo because athletes forced those issues. The IOC is forced, and the International Federation of Handball forced to change their bikini rules because athletes stood up. Time and time again, when we look at what has changed, it's because athletes have been forcing change. Why are they forcing change? Because they want to make sport a better place. And at some point, the IOC, the light needs to go off and say, do we want to continue this adversarial approach with athletes? Or do we want to be partners? Do we want to be allies and grow sport together? Because if they don't, it's going to be a continual controversy. It's going to be a continue head-on-head fight to have forced change. And I think that's where we'd like to see moving forward, is the whole ability to shift that narrative and have partnership and growth versus an adversarial approach. And so that's kind of where we're focused in terms of global athlete. And obviously Beijing is raising and boiling all of these issues to the top of the surface when they've always been there.
Mm-hmm. And Noah, let me turn to you with that. Just in terms of what Rob was saying about athletes coming together, banding together to force change. Given the work that you are doing and given the work that you would like to do in the future, and given the connections that you have with other athletes, how would you like to see that coming to fruition?
Yeah, I mean, as Rob says, I think that this issue, the task seems monumental, right? Because unlike, I mean, to go back to my other example, United Auto Workers, or maybe more aptly, the Major League Baseball Players Association or the NBA, the union, etc., the Olympic sport has kind of a mind-boggling amount of diversity. How do you organize athletes across 208 National Olympic Committees? How do you organize athletes across 40 some odd international federations? I mean, that's not even like the number of different individual sports. That's just like the umbrella organizations. It's a crazy task, but you know, the one thing that's gonna build them enough momentum to make that happen is this continual failure of the IOC to prioritize athletes and to prioritize human rights. As Rob said, I mean, this is not a new issue. We, at the 2008 Olympics in Beijing, we saw athletes being thrown in the middle of a human rights issues, and the IOC promising that the Olympics were going to be a catalyst for human rights in China. Did any of that come to fruition? Absolutely not. We saw in Sochi, the Olympics that I attended, with the state-sponsored doping program that was used to win the medal count and generate all this goodwill that then turned into an invasion of Crimea less than 2 weeks later. Did any of that change? No. We saw when Russia continued to stonewall the IOC and refused to to stonewall WADA, which has way too much connection to the IOC to be an effective regulator. Did we see Russia excluded entirely from the Olympic Games? No, we saw their continued participation, watered down even more by the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which is overseen by the IOC. The consolidation of power and the continual failure to prioritize athletes is what's going to make this happen. And so, yes, it is an enormous task to organize athletes independent of sport administrators, but we're committed to it. And athletes are seeing that it is necessary because Olympic sport continues to fail them, continues to fail the society as a whole, and is hurting itself and its brand, and is really, the bottom line is it's hurting athletes. Athletes not only are hurt by the financial abuse, by the physical abuse, by the lack of freedom of expression, but athletes are also hurt by the way that those issues diminish the star power of the Olympic Games, and therefore diminish the stage for athletes to perform on.
And then what does that also mean for the bidding process? When cities propose a bid to host an Olympics, and then when you look across the globe, and then you have, obviously Beijing and Sochi, and we can go all the way back to 1936 in Berlin when Hitler was in power. The IOC does have this love affair with these authoritarian regimes. So Noah, what would you like to see done with that coalition in place, with athletes, taking some power back? How would you like to see that translated into the bidding process?
Well, I'll start with the fact that we've seen actually a regression on this point of the bidding process. These games in Beijing, the 2022 games, the finalists were Almaty, Kazakhstan, and Beijing after Norway and Oslo dropped out. So you had these two countries with human rights issues, with questionable freedoms, that were the only ones left in the game. And so the IOC's response, rather than to tailor down the requests of host cities, rather than to work with host cities to actually make the Olympic Games a value proposition for countries, they decided instead to put the whole thing behind closed doors and to make it completely opaque and to consolidate their power and say, we're just going to work one-on-one with countries so that the public, which is the group that mobilized to stop the Oslo bid, is no longer able to mobilize against us. We're going to essentially name the host city before we even need the consent of the people who live there. So this is a total regression in how it should be. Instead, there should be a public process. It should be accountable. It should be a negotiation between athletes and administrators, because the athletes are the ones actually performing there. And it should be a process that every country wants to participate in, because there's a huge opportunity for people to host the Olympic Games. Instead, it's just this massive opportunity for corruption and a sinkhole of money and environmental damage and public cost. It does not need to be this way. And so we're moving in the wrong direction. But the right answer is a negotiation with equal power between athletes and administrators, and accountability to all the stakeholders, including athletes and host cities and sponsors and broadcasters, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
Zach, if I could just add to that,
yeah, go ahead, Rob.
The IOC is now acting like a professional sport organization.
Mm-hmm.
So they are negotiating host cities, negotiating places to go without the other aspects of a professional sport organization, which is compensating and ensuring that the athletes have a 50-50 seat around the table. But that's the move, and still acting like a professional sport organization that gets all free money from governments, because governments are the ones that flip the bill for this. So they're acting like one, but they aren't one. And that's kind of the approach they've taken, which is, and I totally agree with everything Noah has said on that issue, but it's amazing.
It is amazing. And you can also make the same case for the bidding process as it pertains to the World Cup. I mean, the upcoming World Cup is going to be in Qatar, and they have an egregious human rights record, and yet they're rewarded with the World Cup. I mean, there's so much there. And Rob, let me just bring this back to you just to kind of put this into historical context, because you hear this all the time. I don't know if you hear this, but I hear this a lot, that the Olympic Games should be this apolitical space where we are free from politics and we just unite under the banner of sportsmanship and goodwill. And while there is some of that, there's much more than what meets the eye. Am I right?
There's nothing further from the truth that there's no politics in sport. It's filled with politics. And that's the rhetoric the IOC tries to use to stay away from any issues and to hide behind their iron curtains. So sport is filled with politics. The IOC itself in Pyeongchang in 2018 decided it was a great idea to combine the North and South Korea ice hockey team. If that's not political, what is? Mm-hmm. The IOC president was the first person to meet the communist leader of China in 2 years. If that's not political, I'm not sure what is political. And the IOC has a requirement when the president goes to the IOC president, Thomas Bach, goes to the countries, that he meets the heads of state. If you're a sport organization, what does the head of state have to do with sport? So this is so far from the truth. It's rhetoric that's convenient, so they don't have to address the issues of human rights, and they continue to move on saying they're politically neutral. It's a fallacy, it's a facade, and it's simply not true.
Absolutely. And like I said in the intro, just look at history. I mean, look up the name Baron Pierre de Coubertin, who was the French aristocrat who was the founder of the modern Olympics in 1896. I mentioned, the 1936 Olympics in Berlin when Hitler was in power. And, look at the relationship of Avery Brundage. Everybody look up Avery Brundage, the former IOC president. There's just a whole host of things there. Obviously, Smith and Carlos in 68, and this year will be the 50th anniversary of the Munich Olympics, and we all know what happened there with the slaughter of the Israeli athletes. And
Zach, the IOC has a seat, an observer seat at the UN. So,
yep.
Political, or are you just sitting there because it's a nice seat?
Yeah, they got good seats.
Right.
So that's true. And then in 2012 in London, they wouldn't even acknowledge the 40th anniversary of the massacre in Munich. And that says a lot within and of itself. Noah, let me ask you, just as an athlete, as an Olympian, you mentioned that this was, your lifelong dream to be able to compete in an Olympics, and you were able to do so twice in 2014 and 2018. What got you interested in doing this work around human rights?
Yeah, it was really having this kind of ideal fallacy of the games shattered. Actually shattered multiple times. As a young person, I was a huge fan of Lance Armstrong. He was literally the person watching who I watched on TV, and then I went out and wanted to emulate. So I'd go on 80 or 100-mile bike rides by myself after watching a stage of the Tour de France because I wanted to be just like Lance. And that's what got me into endurance sports and set me down this path. And then to find out that whole thing was a facade and was cheating, was fraud to the athletes and to the viewers like me, to the young fans in particular, was shattering. It almost drove me from sport before my career even started. And then to get into my own career and to kind of have success and make it to the world stage and make it to the Olympic Games and be in the final pack of the 50K through 48 kilometers, only to then find out, watch the three Russians ski away from the lead pack, to sweep the podium, and then to find out, less than 2 years later that whole thing was a fraud also, and that I was skiing in a rigged race. It just devastated me again. And then, so when I retired from skiing after 2018 and started to actually learn about the structure of international sport governance and learn about the power of the IOC and learn about the lack of accountability and learn about the way that athletes are used in this system to further political power and further monetary gain for people other than athletes, it's just completely infuriating. And so now to see about the ways that to understand more about how the Olympics are used in a geopolitical fight in something that's way bigger than what you initially think of when you think of sport. Really, the biggest issues facing the world stage, like the Russia-Kazakhstan crisis, like the genocide of the Uyghurs. These are all sport issues, even though they don't seem like that on first glance. And so it was this continually having my dreams or my idealistic outlook, broken, that drove me into this work.
Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to add on, what you talked about in terms of the preparation and what it took to get to that point. A lot of people don't really know, or maybe they don't want to know, of what it actually takes to actually make it to an Olympic Games, and then what happens after you get back. I mean, I think about that HBO documentary that Michael Phelps put out not too long ago that's centered on mental health among Olympians and the vulnerabilities that come with that. And so it's not all the glitz and glamour that people make it out to be.
No, absolutely. And you don't have very much support as an athlete, and you don't make very much money. Most Olympic athletes, Michael Phelps is an exception, but most Olympic athletes don't make very much money and have to come out of their careers and reinvent themselves and this identity that they've held, that, an identity that I held for the first 28 years of my life, or I should say from the time I felt like I had an identity until I was 28 years old. All of a sudden it's gone, and you have to figure out what's next and what you're going to do with your life and how you're going to start over. And I've watched teammates go through this. I've gone through this. It's not an easy process, and there's no support from sport administrators. There's very little financial resources available, and athletes are pretty much left to their own devices to figure this out. And we actually see huge issues with kind of mental health crises and suicide for athletes coming out of sport. This is part of what I believe, and I know that Rob and Global Athlete believe, is a duty of sport administrators. If you're gonna facilitate this life for athletes, you have a duty to support them as they're done, and not to just throw them out essentially when they're washed up or when they're injured, when they can no longer compete. Athletes should have a right, like everybody, to be treated with dignity while they're athletes and when they're no longer athletes.
And Rob, did you want to add on to that?
No, I think Noah's outlined it pretty nicely. I mean, the other issue, Zach, which is a bone of contention, the fact that the IOC is generating $1.4 billion in revenues every year. Mm-hmm. Of that, they rightfully state that they distribute 90% of those revenues, but that distribution is proportionally wrong because it goes to national Olympic committees, international federations, museums, goes to host cities, and it goes to their own broadcasting company. And of that, less than 4% is funneled through scholarships to athletes, and directly to athletes from the IOC is 0.5% that athletes receive. And I say that with a caveat. So they're not being compensated to go to these games. And further to that, they're actually told to sign away all their rights. So going into Beijing and all the Olympics prior to, they now have to sign COVID-19 waivers where the athlete assumes all risk. They have to sign away their likeness and image rights to the IOC at no cost. They have to assume all risk in terms of health and security and safety back to the IOC and the organizing committee. So the athlete receives and assumes all risks for attending these games. They're not compensated, and they're told to shut up and compete. There's a major problem here. And exposing it and talking about it and programs like you host, the more we share the realities of a life in Olympian, pre, during, and post, and paint that picture, the more likely we are to get public support, to get other organization and partner support to really push for change and to make that world of an athlete a much safer, stronger, and healthier environment. And that's what we're pushing for in the end. We're there to grow the sport, but make it healthier.
Mm-hmm. Amen to all that. Oh, you had something you want to say, Noah?
Oh, I just want to add on that, I made the point earlier that like athletes are the only ones that can hold the IOC accountable, like Rob is talking, but the other stakeholders have a huge role to play, and that includes sponsors. I do not want to let sponsors off the hook. Sponsors could be instrumental in ensuring that there is independent athlete representation that's holding the IOC accountable. Sponsors could make this happen. They could direct some of their funding to independent athlete organizations. They could require the IOC, as a condition of their support to support independent athlete groups, to listen to and engage with independent athlete groups like Global Athlete and World Players Association, to name a few. So sponsors have a role to play here. This is not, yes, the athletes are the only ones that can kind of be the final entity, the sustainable entity to hold the IOC accountable. But to get us there, we have to have sponsors understanding these issues, understanding the way that their dollars are being used to defraud athletes, to limit athletes' personal rights, to advance violations of human rights. That's all the responsibility of the people funding this movement, not just athletes.
And in this moment where we're expecting corporate partners to become more active in taking certain political and social stands on a whole variety of issues, this is no exception. And we can, some of those partners that come to mind are like Procter and Gamble and Toyota. I mean, those who do all these commercials and publicize the games or in the lead up to the games, they need to be held to account as well. That
they're not doing that out of the goodness of their heart, right? They're profiting off of these games. They're profiting off the backs of athletes, and therefore they have a duty to athletes to look out for their well-being. They have a duty to ensure that athletes are taken care of, and they're honestly, by supporting the Olympic movement without questioning the accountability, they're failing in that duty at the moment.
And Zach, to add what Noah had, just take a look and scan what's happening with the sponsors, advertising leading up to these games. You'll notice an absence of the mention. Like BBC did a splash, and they never once mentioned the Beijing Olympic Games in China. They simply talked about their coverage of the Olympics. You have sponsors that are pulling some of their spots leading into these. Sponsors are well aware what's happening here, but they're doing a similar thing as the IOC, is staying silent, trying to get through these games, generate the revenues, and get out. And that's not acceptable. They need to step up and ensure that this doesn't happen again. And while it's happening, raise issues to the IOC.
Absolutely. And I would also put that onto the media as well. Media who are covering the games need to call it out and to call to attention. I mean, recently, I don't know if you all saw this, but recently the legendary Bob Costas, who's no longer covering the Olympics, has been making the rounds on different media outlets and has been calling the IOC to account for all of these different reasons. And he should know better about the ramifications of it, because famously during the opening ceremonies of the 1996 games in Atlanta, he was the one who pointed out that if anybody had the means to duplicate what the former Eastern Bloc did or the former Soviet Union did when it came to systematic doping in sports, China had the means and the resources to do that. And as a result, after the Olympics, there was a whole campaign from Beijing calling for him to be fired and for him to issue an apology, none of which happened, nor should it have. But we need more media people speaking out, I think, not just Bob Costas, who's no longer covering the Olympics, but also those who are covering the Olympics as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge can of worms you're opening now, because I've spoken to some people that have covered the games, that are host broadcasters, and there's a humongous amount of pressure put on them by the International Olympic Committee to stick to the sports and not raise any other issues happening around the sport. And producers are forcing and pushing their own broadcasters to stick to the sport and not raise any other issues. So
Right.
that's a whole can of worms I'm sure we could spend another day on.
Oh, we could.
Well,
go ahead,
really quickly, where we are seeing a little bit of coverage is all about human rights abuses in China, and coverage of the human rights issues, which is of course a horrible situation, but very little of the coverage is actually putting the blame on the IOC for putting the international community in this situation. We cover the diplomatic boycott of the US government along with a bunch of other governments as if it's this focus on, this thing that's just a natural repercussion of the games being awarded to China, the games going there, without questioning why the games were awarded there in the first place, and putting the onus on the IOC not to let this happen again. The U.S. government should never want to diplomatically boycott a games. It hurts the athletes. It hurts international relations. And so it's the IOC putting athletes, sponsors, governments, host cities, everyone in this situation, right? It's not just the current host cities. It's also London, Paris 2024, and Cortina and Milan 2026, and Los Angeles 2028. The whole Olympic movement is hurt by the IOC's lack of accountability. And so it has to come back to the IOC. The coverage does. It cannot just focus on the abuses in China.
Absolutely.
And I think Zach, that in terms of the media, if you look at Tokyo and you look at leading into Beijing, I think the media, like never before, has been critical, has raised the issues, and has really brought them to the forefront, like never before. And media are covering these issues and exposing what's happening. They're missing maybe the point, who's to blame, as Noah said. But look what everyone's talking about over the last 3 weeks. Not the celebration of the games, but the issues related around China, the way the IOC is treating athletes. So the media are talking about it. Now we need to get the host broadcasters talking about it during the games.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to piggyback off what Noah was saying earlier, which obviously the delicate tightrope that athletes have to navigate, and the advice that you've given them not to speak up while they're there. When it comes to like media, obviously like those are who are there just to cover the event itself, do that to protect yourself and to just do your job, and then to come back home and then find the opportunities and find the avenues to continue to speak up, so that way this conversation doesn't get lost. So it doesn't have to be this either or. It could be both and. Like, you can cover the events for the event itself, but then also find the right time and the safe time to be able to speak up, but continue to speak up so that these issues don't get lost, by the time the next Olympics come around in 2024 in Paris and so on. So before we wrap up here, I just wanted to give both of you some time to tell our viewers how they can follow you, how they can support you. Noah, I'll start with you. How can folks follow you and support your work?
Yeah, I have a brand new Twitter account, so I would love some followers. Literally a week old. It's at HoffNoahMan. So people can give me a follow there, and on my website, noahhoffman.com. I'm on Instagram at HoffNoah. And yeah, I'm also very involved with the work the Global Athlete does. So Rob's answer will also speak for me as well.
Go for it, Rob.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm at Rob Kholer 2. Rob Kholer 2 is my Twitter. I think I have Instagram, but I don't use it. And support Global Athlete. We rely on public funds and private funds to fund our operations. Our funding partner is Fairsport, and if you are interested in donating to our cause, log on to www.fairsport.org. There's a donate button, and all of the money goes to fighting for athlete rights. So we welcome that. And Zach, as again, thank you for having us on and bringing these issues to the forefront.
Oh, it's such an honor to have both of you on. Noah Hoffman, Rob Kholer, thank you for the work that you're doing. You are such a lifeline to athletes all over the world, and giving them a space to speak up and to feel heard and to feel validated and to feel safe. So Rob Kholer, Noah Hoffman, thank you so much for joining us, and keep up the good work.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Zach.
Our thanks to both Noah and Rob. And while we are on the theme of human rights, I wanted to take a moment just to acknowledge today, which is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. It is a day to honor and remember the victims of one of the worst atrocities in world history. It is on this day that we remember the lives of 6 million Jews, 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population, and millions of others that were slaughtered by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. January 27th was chosen because it was on this day in 1945 that the concentration camp in Auschwitz was liberated. And today, with hate crimes rising, as has been an ongoing case for several years, and with anti-Semitism on the rise, it is not enough to simply remember. It is incumbent on all of us to do whatever it takes to stop the scourge of hate. We must speak out against acts of hate and bigotry whenever we see them, and hold those perpetrating those acts accountable from the top down. We also must educate the younger generations about this history, and even more so in light of the ongoing attempts to prohibit the teaching of history right now, so that we can raise a generation that is committed to love, justice, and solidarity. And sport can be that educational tool. Global Athletes is a vital resource to help facilitate these kinds of conversations. So on this day, International Holocaust Remembrance Day, we must repeat it over and over again. Never forget and never again. Be sure to follow NBS on all of our social media platforms and subscribe us here on our YouTube channel. My name is Zachary Draves, and on behalf of all of the NBS team, thank you for watching and have a good night.